Hi, this is Christian with Dark Portents, and today I'm going to be reviewing Knight of Knives by Ian C Esslemont. It'll be the first full book review that I have on the channel, and I decided to read and review it after I saw that Philip Chase and AP Canavan reviewed it in discussion with the author on their channels, and I wanted to get a taste of what Malazan was like outside of Stephen Erickson's writing. Sorry for the hater blockers, but I can't see anything without my glasses and their transition lenses, which I didn't think about filming when I made that decision. But it's this or squint at you the entire time, so we'll go with this. Now, I'm going to make the review spoiler-free and then have a spoiler section at the end, so I'll give you a spoiler warning when I go into spoilers, and yeah, let's get on with the review. So I'm going to be trying to use the CAWPILE review system to generate my star rating for Knight of Knives. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the CAWPILE system, I'll link it down in the description down below, the video of the person who created the CAWPILE system. But I'll just briefly go over it with you for a minute, and I'd like you to comment if you have opinions on whether I should use the CAWPILE system as a way to frame the discussion on books that I review. So the CAWPILE system, it's an acronym, and it's characters, atmosphere, writing style, plot, intrigue, logic and relationships, and finally enjoyment. You go through and you rate each of these on a scale of 1 to 10, and then you average them out by dividing the total by 7, which is the number of categories, and then you generate your star rating that way. So I've gone through and I've rated each of these categories, but I'm going to talk in the spoiler-free section about each of them without revealing too much about the book for those of you who haven't read it. All right, so let's start with the characters. So I'll have a lot more to say about the characters when we get into the spoiler section, but for now I'll just say that Knight of Knives has very well done character work. It's not the best character work that I've ever read in the genre or in the Malazan universe, but there are several things about it that I absolutely love. Esslemont takes some of the well-known character types that you're probably used to if you've read much fantasy, and he, in classical Malazan style, does a little twist on each of them and uses them and deploys them in ways that are a bit different than what you may be used to from fantasy. And there's a rich cast of characters. There's really only 2 main characters in terms of protagonists. There are more than that for point of view characters, but there are very clearly 2 main characters in this work, which is a lot different from how other Malazan books are written, but I did appreciate the way he used them. But the secondary and tertiary characters, the characters that these main POV characters meet, they're all really fun. Some of them are unique, that are not like anything you've ever seen in the genre before, or even in Malazan before, if you're coming off of the first few books of Book of the Fallen like I am. And some of them are characters that you may have met in the Book of the Fallen, and it's really exciting to see how Esslemont treats those that you've seen in Erickson's work, if you're a Book of the Fallen reader. So I've rated the characters an 8 out of 10. They're great characters, but like I said, not the best character work I've ever seen. Still, 8 out of 10 is amazing. As far as atmosphere goes, especially if you haven't read Malazan before, and this is your first introduction to the Malazan world, I don't get to experience that because I started with Gardens of the Moon by Stephen Erickson, but this setting evokes a whole new world to explore, and it just makes you want to know about the world, about the setting, and that desire that it evokes in the reader is very well satisfied. And of course I'll talk about that more in the spoiler section, but for now I'll just say that this setting comes to life, and you feel how charged with tension every moment is at the location that the book takes place in. I'll mention more about what I mean by that a little later. The tone is just like visceral. You can feel the tone of like horror and epic fantasy just bleeding from every page, and it's just so, you're there, you feel it. So I rated it 10 out of 10 on atmosphere. Just one of the most atmospheric fantasy books I've ever read. Very unique atmosphere, and you feel it, and it's great. As far as the writing style, now for those of you that have read Stephen Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, if you go into Night of Knives expecting the writing style to be exactly the same as Erikson's, it's not going to live up to that, but it is really well written, and I personally love Cameron Esslemont's writing style. The prose is not as dense as Erikson's, it's not as poetic, and it's not even packed with as much subtext as Erikson, though there is still quite a bit in the subtext in Night of Knives. But it is easier to follow than Erikson, and it makes up for being relatively less rich than Erikson's writing and prose by pulling you along word by word, page by page. The prose has a rhythm, the writing has a rhythm and a tempo that makes you just not want to stop. You just, while you're reading this thing, that's all you want to do. You don't want to put the book down, and it's just amazing. I gave it a 9 out of 10. It's not the greatest writing that I've ever read in the genre or in Malazan, but it's so close. It was just a beautifully written book, and I loved it. As far as the plot of Night of Knives is so awesome. It keeps you interested all along the way. It's well paced. There's frantic action and fast developments, but there's also appropriate periods of rest that make sense and are integrated into the logic of the book. And just so much happens in this book. And it's such a short book. It's only takes 10 hours to do the audiobook. Probably less if you're reading a physical copy. I did both. And it's packed with just grand events and horror and intrigue, and any reader is going to walk away feeling satisfied. I mean, if you like fantasy and horror, at least, and if you like Malazan, etc., with this plot. With one notable exception, for me at least, there was one subplot that didn't really come together, and I'm assured that it will be explored in later novels, and I have enough trust in Cam and Erikson at this point to believe that and be ready for more on it. But first feelings after putting down the book, there was one subplot that kind of took away from it. So I rated this a 9.5 when it comes to plot, for that reason. Now, in AP Canavan and Philip Chase's review and discussion with Esslemont, AP called this book a concentrated dose of Malazanness. It's a very concentrated representation of what's in the Malazan world, and it's despite being so short, there's just so much packed in there, and it's just so rich. And I would go further than to say it's just a concentrated dose of Malazanness, to say that Night of Knives is the most concentrated dose of epic fantasy I've ever taken, which is part of what makes this book so thrilling. It's just, there's just so much packed into such a brief work. I loved it. Now, as far as intrigue goes, oh man, this book constantly kept me wondering what would happen next, what the implications were for the plot as a whole. It's very suspenseful. There was obviously, for those of you that have read Guardians of the Moon and maybe some other books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, there was one subplot where you pretty much know how it ends because you've read that before, but I still felt hooked, waiting to see exactly how it would happen, and how my supposed knowledge of events stacked up against the reality of those events as written by Cam, which is, that's a big thing in Malazan Book of the Fallen, is that is that they have this critique of knowledge that they don't not. Cam's books and Erickson's books might have some contradictions with each other because nobody knows everything, even about the world that they've created together. Though mostly they're pretty well complement each other's writings, and it gels together. So I rated it on intrigue just a 10 out of 10. Now on logic and relationships, everything felt consistent with both within the book itself and in the context of what I've read of the Malazan world so far. The relationships between the different elements of the work, between the magic system in the world, between the different characters, between the characters and the setting, and so on. It was all very believable. Everything was fully integrated into a cohesive world. And yeah, so that's just 10 out of 10. Perfect score on logic. And if you haven't been able to tell by how I've been gushing about this book so far, on enjoyment, I rate this a 10 out of 10. The book's an absolute page-turner. I enjoyed every minute. I found myself wondering how some Malazan fans can suggest that Cameron's novels aren't as good as Erickson's, and I was just constantly anxious to return to the book, and I left it completely satisfied, aside from that one little subplot that I mentioned earlier. So overall, on the CAWPILE rating system, I got an average of 9.5 for Knight of Knives by Ian C Esslemont, which is a 5-star rating. So 5 stars. If you haven't read it, go read it. If you're in the middle of Book of the Fallen, you know, at some point when you get a break or you want a breather from Book of the Fallen, pick this thing up. It's great. Now, who would I recommend this book to? I would recommend Knight of Knives to anybody who wants to get a taste of the Malazan world, but is not necessarily ready to pick up a 10-book series of epic fantasy giant tome doorstoppers that is the Book of the Fallen, or that maybe wants a writing style that's not as reminiscent of the old Shakespearean tragedies and Greek epics and other epics as Book of the Fallen, but just wants the, that little concentrated dose of Malazan to see what the world has to offer them. And I would recommend this to anybody who likes the Book of the Fallen and wants to read more about this world, especially if you've read the first couple of books in the Book of the Fallen. You should check out Knight of Knives. Now we're going to move into spoilers, so you've been warned. So out of every character I've ever read in the Malazan world, Kiska, who's one of the two main characters in Knight of Knives, is the one who I feel most understands the kind of novel that she's in. Well, full disclosure, I've only read the first 2.5 books of Book of the Fallen, and a couple of novellas, and then Knight of Knives. So there may be others, but at least for me, Kiska is the first character that I've met who really seems to grasp what kind of book she's in. She's constantly considering other people's point of view and how they would view her based on what they know about her. And for anybody who's read any amount of Malazan, you know that a lot of what Malazan is showing multiple points of view on different stories and different conflicts, and really not having a flat narrative where knowledge is certain and known and where morality is certain and known, but instead showing that everybody's the protagonist in their own story, and the facts, so-called facts, are not necessarily easy to determine. So Kiska's just very aware of the limitations of her point of view, and is constantly trying to think about how others perceive the events around her and perceive her actions. Great character. And Temper, who's the other main character in Knight of Knives, brings the reader in on a lot of the political struggles that took place preceding the events of the book. We get a few remembered flashback sequences to Temper and his career as a Malazan soldier as part of what's known as the Sword, which is Dasim Ultor and his group of bodyguards or comrades that helped Kellenved, Dancer, and co. Do their conquest on 7 cities and probably other places that I don't know about yet. And so we get a little taste of what the antagonisms between Dasim and Surly were through him. We get a little taste of how Dasim viewed Dancer and Kellenved, and we just, get that viewpoint through Temper. And it really helps the reader catch a lot of the subtext, even if they're not familiar with the Book of the Fallen. They'll obviously, me reading this, I've read the first couple books in the Book of the Fallen, and yeah, just and he was also just a great character. Took the trope of the grizzled veteran and played around with it and did some cool things with it. As far as the secondary characters, I did not understand the fisherman character. That was at the beginning of a couple of the chapters. Can't say I have a good read on him yet. If there's anything that you think would help me understand that character that only takes into account this first book, feel free to tell me in the comments, but I didn't get him, and I did not get the subplot that involved him. It was great to see Tayshrin in a different light than that we saw in Gardens of the Moon, so that was really cool. Obo was a really interesting character, even though we got him very sparingly. I loved Agala, who kind of seems like just this hedge witch in Malaz City, but she ends up like being alongside these like legendary, powerful mages and knowing a lot about the world. Like she has a relationship with Tayshrin, she has a relationship with Obo, and that was great. And my favorite character in the book was Edgewalker. Oh man, that guy's cool. I want to read more about Edgewalker. I hope he shows up some more in either Cameron's works or in the Book of the Fallen. And even the tertiary characters were really well done, and their relationships with the 2 main characters were awesome. And to bring up some of the things I couldn't bring up about atmosphere in the spoiler-free section, I loved the bar and how much you get a sense of what the bar is normally like and of what it's like with all these grizzled veterans and thugs hanging around on the Night of Knives. When Temper comes into the bar, you get the sense of like how off the atmosphere is in that bar, the one that's right across from the dead house. As he's kind of taking in the differences between what he's used to and what it's like that night. The Shadow Warren was so cool, the way that people kept coming in and out of it, and the different ways that the Shadow Warren sort of looked, and the different terrain that it represented, and all the encounters with Edgewalker on the edges of the Shadow Warren, and the hounds bringing in that horror feel. Very cool. The iceberg, even though I didn't really understand that subplot, was really cool, and had like a pretty good horror feel. Monk's Hold felt really lived in, and just you felt like you were at Monk's Hold. It really turned the whole setting of Malaz City, as well as the different warrens, like the Shadow Warren and the Thyre Warren, or Thyre, however you say that, and Amtos Flock. It really brought all that to life, and you feel like you're there. It's great. And I loved, speaking of things I couldn't bring up in the spoiler-free section, I loved the way that the events of the plot and the setting were all focused just on one location, being Malaz City, and on one night. Although it being one location is a little floppy, a little, wobbly, because obviously you have the Warrens, and there were a lot of flashback sequences with Temper. And the way that they had the 2 main characters never interact directly, but that Kiska saw Temper at some of his most horrific moments. And you see those 2 scenes, both from her perspective and from Temper's perspective. And she thinks he's some kind of like fantasy creature because he's got his crazy looking armor and helmet on and all of that. And that was just so cool. And if you haven't figured it out by now, the subplot that I didn't understand was the one with the writers. I didn't get it. So we'll see if I get it more as I continue reading Cameron's works. And the the mystery around why Shadow Throne was empty before Kellanved claimed it, and the fact that Kellanved never thought to ask himself why it was empty. So cool. And of course, the big reveal of the book that Dasim Ultor is alive, probably, question mark, was awesome to get in on. So that's my review of Knight of Knives. Feel free to ask questions or make comments in the comments section, and that's Dark Portent signing out.